Welcome to lecture number 13 of the Cardiovascular Section of the Integrative Systems Physiology course. So today what we're going to be talking about is comparative physiology, some of the key principles for comparative physiology, since so much of our data and understanding of the cardiovascular system is derived from other species. It's critical to have an appreciation for some of the strengths and limitations and differences with some of these different species from which our data and understanding are derived. So when we look at the overall goals of this lecture, I think they're really twofold. One is to understand the key differences in cardiovascular physiology between a handful of species. And two is to understand how those differences influence our translation of those findings across different species and hopefully to provide you with a framework on which to apply this towards numerous examples in the future. Primary species that we are going to be discussing today are going to be, of course, the human, the dog, and the mouse. And the human will serve as our frame of reference for the vast majority of our discussion. So when we look at some of the key differences and similarities between humans and dogs, humans, of course, are actually, they're naturally not so athletic. The great human athletes have a VO2 max, or maximum oxygen consumption, up to 88 mils of oxygen per kilogram per minute, and that would be a very astronomical oxygen consumption by a true elite athlete. Like myself, and for dogs, you'd say the dogs are actually naturally athletic. And so great sled dog athletes, such as Iditarod sled dogs, they have a VO2 max of up to 240 mils of oxygen per kilogram per minute. So tremendously higher than what is observed in human athletes. When we look at normal cardiac parameters in humans, we've got a normal ejection fraction, or the fraction of blood that's ejected from the heart per beat, of about 65%, 65 to 70%. Heart rate is generally around 70 beats per minute. With dogs, their ejection fraction is about 65% as well, and their heart rate is very size dependent. So the smaller the animal, generally the higher the heart rate with regards to dogs. Now, of course, we are bipedal, which puts us in a unique position where actually 70% of our blood volume is below the heart, whereas dogs are quadrupedal, and they have roughly 70% of their blood volume being above the heart. So it's a tremendous advantage when providing a filling pressure for the right side of the heart. Of course, these physiological implications, just to expand on this a little bit, of having 70% of the blood volume above or below the heart, of course, is you need to get the blood back to the heart to be pumped back out to the circulation, and certainly pumped through the lungs back to the left side of the heart, back to circulation. And the challenge here is that there's a tremendous amount of energy that is lost in the veins. And so if you recall back to our prior lectures, we don't have a large amount of elastin in which we can store that potential energy inside the veins. And similarly, we don't have the same type of pulsatility that we have in the aortic side to enable the conversion of that potential and stored energy into anterograde blood flow in the veins like we do in the arterial system. So since they are very high compliance, they are fantastic reservoirs and capacitance vessels, but maybe not necessarily the best to get a tremendous amount of blood volume back to the central circulation, particularly against gravity. And so interestingly, when you take quadrupeds and you place them in the same position that humans would be in. So these studies have been done largely in rabbits by NASA and other organizations that are interested in understanding the impact of gravity on the circulatory system. Most quadrupeds will have massive pooling of blood in the veins and death if they're placed in a bipedal position for 24 to 48 hours. And so there, you'd say, well, it'd be great to have your dog walk around on two legs for a long time, and dance around the living room or whatnot. Really not so sustainable for quadrupeds to be in that type of disadvantageous position. And they have subsequently had adaptations peripherally that enable them to survive quite well with this large amount of blood volume above the heart. Really don't survive very well with the substantial amounts of blood below the heart and have tremendous fluid exudation as well. So when we are looking at this sort of quadrupedal cardiac filling advantage, you say, well, how big of an advantage is it really? So, of course, we've got our hydrostatic column, and that can be, the magnitude of that can be calculated by rho GH, where rho is the density of blood, G is the force imparted to it by gravity, and H is the height of that hydrostatic column. So you can see here it's in dynes per centimeter squared, which is kind of a whole lot of nothing most of the time. But basically, you can go through and you can do some calculations here where you got about 1 millimeter mercury being 1,300 dynes per centimeter squared. And essentially what this equates to is that even a 7 centimeter hydrostatic column, right? So not a very tall hydrostatic column in a dog, will confer a benefit of increasing cardiac filling pressure by about 5 millimeters of mercury. Okay, so that's just 7 centimeters, right? And we say, well, who really cares, right? Well, when we look at that shift of what 5 millimeters of mercury will do for cardiac filling, you can see over here, if we're normally around 0 for humans in an upright position, and you were to shift rightward 5 millimeters of mercury with regards to cardiac filling pressure, you would actually be near a maximum cardiac filling pressure for any given level of cardiac contractility. And so you can see that certainly in the dog, their ability to operate at a relatively high volume and relatively high filling pressure and have relatively high ability to have optimized cardiac filling is tremendous, even for a relatively short hydrostatic column. So there, small columns even confer tremendous advantages. Now there are other extremes to this where you'd say, well, there's one thing if you're upside down, right? Then you say, well, okay, I can shift my hydrostatic columns around, and maybe 7 millimeters of mercury is a big deal. That's all fine. But what about some other extremes? So when we look at humans, the arterial blood pressure at your feet when you're standing up is actually around 200 millimeters of mercury, and that's roughly 100 millimeters of mercury that's flow dependent. So that's the blood pressure that you'd normally be measuring, and 100 millimeters of mercury that's hydrostatic, right? So the height of that hydrostatic column. Now, the giraffe, in contrast, the arterial blood pressure at the feet is roughly 400 millimeters of mercury, right? So it is nearly twice of what it is in humans, and that has roughly 250 millimeters of mercury being flow dependent and 150 millimeters of mercury being hydrostatic. So tremendous increase in the stress that is being placed in those capillary beds, in those arteries at the feet of the giraffe, in large part because of this increase in the hydrostatic column, as well as an increase in flow-dependent pressure. And so you say, well, what are the adaptations that occur when you have such a high pressure? Because for us to double our blood pressure, you'd expect that A, you'd have significant problems systemically, and B, even if you were able to protect sensitive organs like the kidneys or the brain or the lungs, for example, with a very high perfusion pressure, you would still anticipate that you would have very substantial fluid exudation into the interstitium there. If you think back to Starling's laws of fluid flux inside from the capillary to the interstitium. So simply put, there must be adaptations there, because we don't really see giraffes walking around with tremendous pitting edema and big flabby elephant feet on them, to say, well, hey, that's a great new species to see around. The adaptations that largely occur there, if you think through it, well, they say on the one hand they have very high tissue pressures, right? And they have very low tissue osmotic pressures. So that combination in and of itself prevents fluid exudation into the interstitium, right? And of course they've got very tight skin and very thick skin. So that tissue pressure is enabled by having that relatively tight surroundings and of course low tissue osmotic pressure. So if you go back to the prior lecture, look at those equations, you should be able to see that these are the two places where the pressure gradient, the hydrostatic pressure gradient is optimized, as well as the osmotic tissue pressure gradient to minimize fluid exudation into the interstitium. Now, if you say, well, what happens when you go down to take a drink then, right? Because a giraffe taking a drink, if you say, well, if you hang upside down, you get a tremendous increase in cerebral vascular pressure. And the issue there is that we actually have fewer veins leaving, valves in the veins leaving from the cerebral circulation because we're not really meant to be upside down, and we don't have to go upside down to go do things like take a drink and whatnot. If a giraffe takes a drink, there's still a significant increase in cerebral vascular pressure, but there it's minimized by a relatively large number of valves and veins leaving the cerebral circulation. So by having those valves closed at a number of places down, exiting the cerebral circulation, that enables the disruption of that hydrostatic column and the minimization of the height of that column to enable a lower cerebral vascular pressure. So when we start looking at examples of other adaptive differences between humans and dogs, there are certainly numerous ones, but one that's particularly impressive is the ability to withstand tachycardia. So if we take humans, we put them, make them tachycardic, so put them at a heart rate of about 240 beats per minute, generally speaking, that human will be relatively incapacitated. The issue there is that our filling pressure is not sufficient to optimize cardiac filling at those very high emptying rates, and we can't fill in a shorter period of time. And the cardiomyocytes, they just can't clear calcium fast enough. So if you end up going above 200 to 240 beats per minute, it ends up being a tremendous stress to the system. Now, dogs, in contrast, when you pace them at 240 beats per minute, there are models where you do this to induce heart failure in dogs. 240 beats per minute, they're outwardly fine. When we did studies like these in the University of Wisconsin, again, you'd start the pacemaker and the dog would just look at you like, what's going to happen now, right? Really nothing going on there. And so the issues there and advantages that they have are that they have much higher filling pressures than we depicted previously, and they have far superior calcium dynamics. So they can clear calcium at a much more rapid rate than humans can. And again, be very outwardly fine at a heart rate of 240 beats per minute for oftentimes for weeks at a time. Ultimately, they will develop cardiac failure due to some compensatory mechanisms that are activated as a result of that. But again, their acute response is quite dramatically different than what's observed in humans. Now, with humans, even with a heart rate of 150 beats per minute, the heart will actually eventually dilate and ejection fraction will decrease. And so most humans will become quite symptomatic and an ejection fraction less than 30%, and even oftentimes an ejection fraction is less than 40 or 50%. We have substantial declines in physical capacity. And so here even my father ended up having a heart rate of 150 beats per minute for a sustained period of time with atrial fibrillation, and developed pretty substantial ejection fraction declines in ejection fraction. Now in dogs, they'll eventually dilate and ejection fraction will eventually decrease. But realistically, they don't become outwardly symptomatic until ejection fraction often goes below 15%. And so it's tremendously different response and symptomaticity at a much more severe level than what's observed in humans. So that brings the question, well, what about the difference between humans and other species? If we compare humans to mice, which is a tremendously popular model to understand cardiovascular physiology, humans, we've got normal cardiac parameters, again, heart rate around 70 beats per minute. Mice, they've got normal heart rates between 600 and 700 beats per minute. So again, tremendously different even as compared to dogs. Our ejection fraction, 65%. Mice are going to be closer to 80 to 100%, so a tremendously higher ejection fraction as well, in addition to that very high heart rate. Our pulse pressures are roughly 40 to 50 millimeters of mercury, systolic pressure maybe 110, diastolic 60. Of course, a lot of variance there depending on the person. Pulse pressure in mice is actually significantly smaller, with 30 to 40 millimeters of mercury, with having a very similar systolic pressure. But the difference is now they've got elevations in diastolic pressure, because normally during that phase of diastole, where you're having a prolonged period in humans where blood pressure drops and you've got that transmission of the potential energy inside the aortic wall being converted to kinetic energy and driving blood forward. Now, as that decline is occurring, you can envision that there's just going to be another heartbeat coming right on the end of that. So diastolic pressure ends up not having the same duration for that decline and having a higher diastolic pressure over time. In terms of utility, there are many similarities between humans and mice, but some of the studies in arrhythmogenesis in mice have really been frustrating. So there are a lot of them, but I think most investigators would agree that these studies can lend some insight into the origins of dysrhythmias in mice with really highly penetrant phenotypes. But the issue is that most investigators would agree that animals with a slower heart rate, such as rabbits and oftentimes dogs, they're more optimal species. And that's just because the calcium dynamics are so much more similar in those species with slower heart rates as compared to mice and really rodents in general. Of course, the major disadvantage of these larger species is that the options for genetic manipulation remain limited. And even though CRISPR-Cas9 has really been a pretty transformative technology to induce genetic alterations in a variety of species, it's still developmentally a much longer period of time for these species to reach maturation and ultimately be able to study animals in a non-juvenile state, particularly when you have conditions that you feel are more penetrant in adults. So altogether, just from a very high level, these are some of the sort of key differences that I want you to appreciate and sort of start to think about as you think of how do you apply some of the data that are derived from some of these species to humans, or if you're designing an experiment, what's the most appropriate species to use, and then once you have that data, how do you bring it back with its functional implications for humans? Very complicated in a lot of ways, and this is just very much scratching the surface with just a handful of species, but hopefully you found it of utility, and we'll certainly look forward to discussing it in more detail in class. Thank you.